Hello, this is Rose Sumaya, and this is a presentation on differentiated instruction. So, simply put, differentiated instruction gives students a way to learn the content that you are presenting by knowing their learning styles, their preference for learning, and knowing a way to engage them and understand what they need to know, where they're coming from, what skill level they're on. Um, when we do this, we can make learning exciting for each student, and will they will eventually end up retaining the information better by learning in a way that they prefer. Awareness of the student's skill level is a great starting point on knowing how to differentiate learning for each student by knowing, as I said previously, the readiness for being able to learn a certain subject. If you have students who know very little, you can pair them together. If you have students who know a lot about a subject, you can pair them together, or you could even pair them up with one another. This will help keep students from being bored, and once again, it's engaging for them. Knowing their interest by doing like a student interest inventory, you can help keep your students engaged and keep them curious, which always is a better environment for learning. And knowing their learning profile, so knowing how they like to learn, what environmental factors can hinder or improve their learning, and also just being aware of the influence that culture and gender can have on students is a good starting place to know where to begin with um, differentiating learning. So by knowing what differentiated learning is not, we can better understand what it is. So as this questions point out, um, delivering instruction by lecturing is not a great way of learning for every student. Only using one type of assessment per for the whole school year, and then also giving points for classroom participation. So we're going to learn in the next few slides how that why those aren't great ways of learning, and how we can use differentiated learning in those situations or instead of those situations. So when a teacher delivers instruction by only lecturing, as in the Iris video, talks about a high school teacher who had honor students and upper levels of math who he could lecture to, and the students would understand what was going on. And when he began to teach a lower level algebra class where he had many types of students, he found that his test scores were lower and it seemed like student engagement was down. This is because he had probably a more diverse student body and needed to find a different way to reach out to the students. So when a teacher only lectures, they are only able to engage a certain type of student, which is generally an average student. Um, and once again, it does not engage all the learning types because it's just a stand up in front of the classroom, take notes type of situation. Some students need to be broken down into small groups. And this is a way to approach it differently. By doing a small group, you can have the students be able to teach each other or ask questions to one another, work problems together. If you are that math teacher, you can have group discussions, so that way if there's questions and problems that the students are having, they can come to light in a group setting, which is a good way for students to understand that they aren't the only ones having questions, and It's a good way for the teacher to understand where they need to improve their teaching because the students aren't understanding the material. Having students choose the way they like to learn is also a great way to counter the lecturing learning type, because then the student can decide what they feel is best for them. And by allowing them to choose, it also ups the engagement of the learning material. So groupings are a important factor in differentiated learning. And there are various ways that you can approach grouping. There's a whole group situation, which would include like a class discussion, as previously mentioned. A small group would be less than 6 students. And peer-to-peer would be a student-to-student situation, and independent, just meaning working alone. Heterogeneous and homogeneous, they apply to the type of grouping that you are putting your students in. So in a heterogeneous group, you would have your students who maybe are a little bit different. You could have students who don't know the information as well as some struggling learners, with some students who are more advanced in the subject matter. You could also have students that learn in different types of ways paired together. In a homogeneous group, you would have students, maybe all your advanced readers together and your lower level readers together, or same thing with this peer-to-peer situation. You could just have 2 students who learn similarly paired up so that they can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. And the key to this is that in your groupings, you want to keep them flexible, which means that you shouldn't just choose one way to group your students. You should constantly be, putting them in different types of groups, bigger, smaller, heterogeneous and homogeneous, just to get everyone engaged and learning to their best ability. And maybe they can even learn stuff from each student by having the opportunity to work all together. So in this example of what differentiated instruction is not, talk about having grouping students at the beginning of the year based on their previous test scores. Well, the problem with doing this is that it ignores their potential progress, meaning maybe over the summertime they took a class or were at a summer camp that increased their knowledge to some degree, or maybe they just matured more. Something could have happened that changed them, and you're only basing things on the previous year. And the other reason this is not the best way is that it's only using one category on assessing your students. So you're just using test scores, which is okay, an okay component to take into consideration, but not a good way to just to assess a whole year. So the way to approach that differently is to have your students constantly assessed, on ongoing assessment. You want to assess before, during, and after, and use very many methods of assessing your students to help them keep them engaged, keep things fresh, make sure everyone's understanding. So here we have the breakdown of ongoing assessment, the before, during, and after, and just some examples of what those look like. So as in the previous slide, test scores before the students come to your classroom for the year, that's one way of assessing, but also having a student self-report, observing them before you do a unit, so you know where they're at. During, you can use the journal entries, quizzes, just talking, a small student conference, just trying to gauge where they're at during that particular piece of time, so that way you can understand if you need to be adjusting the way that you're teaching or the way that they're being grouped. And then afterwards, you can use your test. You can make a project, allow your student to demonstrate in their own way how they have learned. And that's another great way to kind of keep on par with knowing if you're meeting the core curriculum. And here we have our third situation for what differentiated learning is not. Um, so the situation is giving bonus points for classroom participation. Well, the reason why that's not great is because your students should be the ones driving the material and the learning, and the students should be engaged. So it shouldn't be an issue of having to get points to be engaged. The lessons should already be engaging. The groupings should already be engaging, and they should be participating that way. If you're finding that you need to help you figure out how to engage your students, you can use the approach of using student interest inventories to help understand what your students may like, breaking down into groups to keep that participation rolling in case you have students who don't want to participate in a large group setting. Um, if they just want to participate one-on-one, then that's a great way to participate. Not everyone is into big groups. And then once again, letting your students decide how they can demonstrate their knowledge and how they would like to be broken down into groups or how they would like to participate. By allowing them once again to choose how they want to demonstrate their learning, it will keep them engaged because they will be invested in the product. So what does incorporating differentiated learning into the classroom look like? There's a lot of different ways it can look, but as we've talked about, group, small groups, that's an easy way to get started. Using only differentiating in one subject area or at one time of day, starting small. And only doing one activity per lesson is also a good way to make it easier to start incorporating the differentiation into your classroom. And then assigning homework based on interest and readiness, I think, is an awesome way to start differentiating out lessons. That way your students will be engaged in their homework. They won't feel like it's too hard and they won't feel like it's too easy, and they will hopefully be able to take that with them and have a better understanding when they come back to class. So in the final video on the IRIS website, Carol Ann Tomlinson discusses 5 key aspects to differentiated learning, and 4 of them came from one of her students, but they are all very much tied into the stuff we have already talked about. Having an engaging learning environment, which will keep your students interested, it will make them want to do better, it will make them achieve better. Having a high quality curriculum, so making sure that you as the teacher understands what goals your students need to be hitting, how to make this happen for them, how to help them. If you don't know the curriculum, then you can't be the best teacher that you can be. Ongoing assessment, like we've talked about before, is just knowing before, during, and after how to assess what's going on, using different methods for assessment to really get a good gauge of where your students are at. And then and these kind of tied together, but the response to the students' needs through the ongoing assessment and through the response of students responding to your students' needs, you can kind of continually gauge where your students are at and then keep tweaking the process. You're never going to have it perfect. You're going to have different students. You're never going to always know exactly what needs to happen. So being responsive and continually assessing is a great way to keep that flow going. And then the one that Carol Ann Tomlinson put in that her student had not, and I'm sure this comes with knowing um, after actually being in a classroom, but effective classroom management. And the reason this is important is because there has to be a structural environment that is conducive to letting the students get up and move around and be able to engage in these different types of groups. So overall, differentiated learning is really a great way to get all your students learning what they need to learn, having them be interested and engaged, and altogether that ends up making your students happier.